Okay, so good evening to you. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre, and it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome not just you here tonight, but these amazing people who produced Engaging China, which, if you haven't yet bought a copy, is available outside right now. Before we go, at a 20% discount, and indeed they'll all sign it for you too. Before we start, may I acknowledge the lands of the people on where we are meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We recognise that these lands were never ceded, nor given away or bought, and we respect their traditions and practices of their elders past, present and emerging. So my task now is almost done. I'm going to hand over to Glenda, who is going to chair this amazing session. I don't think I've ever seen such a wonderful lineup of people writing about China, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed.
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for coming today on this really very important subject. Now, part of what we're doing today is launching this book called Engaging with China, How Australia Can Lead the Way Again. And it was partly brought about by the desire to mark the 50 years of Australia-China relationship, but to drill down into a whole lot of different areas, from security to education to business to cultural connections, to look at the Australia-China relationship. And the driving force behind this publication is two people from Sydney University, Jamie Riley and Jindong Yuan, who's here. And they had the idea 2 years ago to do this. And we've got 8 panellists, and the eight of us wrote different chapters. There were more chapters, but they're here today to sort of drill down into the specifics of their chapter and the subject matter that they're across. Sort of the subject of today, we've actually called it Re-engaging with China and Opportunities and Challenges under the Labor government, because as we all know, and as the book chronicles, the relationship with China on many fronts has it went down. It became very tense under the Morrison government, and probably a couple of years ago, or it was at was a recent low, despite the fact that we've got very many people of Chinese descent in Australia, and the fact that China's Australia's largest trading partner. So when the idea for this book was conceived, it was 2 years ago, and those of us involved, we sort of felt it was quite depressing, because we felt that maybe relationship wasn't going to turn around, maybe there wasn't going to be an improvement. And I suppose it's good to see that things have turned around a little bit. And we're hoping for a bit more. But what the book and the people here are talking about is the importance and the need to engage with China on many fronts. And this is an advantage for Australia. This is in our own interest to do this. But of course, we've seen all the discussion about, the China threat, which came to dominate the security discussion, and people wanting to know what's really happening in China, and the fact that China itself has been closed and is quite opaque has also made that challenge difficult. But I suppose what we're trying to do here, is drill down into the different subject matters and just see where the writers of the chapters feel things are going. Is there any improvement, and is there a way of Australia leading the way? Because those of you who might have studied Australian history will know that Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in 1971 visited China, and 1973 as Prime Minister visited China, and Australia was one of the first countries to recognise China. So there was a point 50 years ago, and where we were leading the way in relations with China, but we're a long way from that at the moment. Anyway, let's turn to the authors, and I want to start with you, Jindong Guan, who's known as JD. Can you tell us what was behind you wanting to do this book, and how do you think things have changed? Because it's been 2 years of wrangling all of us to produce this very detailed book.
Yeah, thanks, Glenda, for that introduction. You have already alluded to, the reasoning behind the book. 2 years ago, Jamie and I were, anticipating the upcoming 50th anniversary of the former diplomatic relations between China and Australia. At the time, we all knew about the how the bilateral relationship between China and Australia really went the rock bottom. And so we were thinking, what should we do? One initial thought is we would write up an opinion piece, but then we thought maybe a better way is to have a collective effort to produce a book to mark the 50th anniversary, with the engagement as the key running theme. Now here, engagement doesn't mean that everything will end well, but engagement is to the courage and the wisdom in maintaining channels of communication and dialogue. So I think that is very important, and we deliberately set the date for, so we commissioned authors from the Sydney area, given at the time a number of states were still in lockdown. So we just focus on the authors in the city, but we tried to reach out as many organizations as possible. So we had, UNSW, UTS, Macquarie, so basically cover every major institutions. And then we set up the date deliberately on the May the 20th, and anticipating, actually I'm joking, the next day would be the election. So we would see the authors, half of the authors would have to rewrite significantly their chapter there. So Jamie and I wrote the intro, chapter to cover the general kind of structured trends, and mainly focusing on the last 10 years since we wrote the first Australia-China book. We edited that one at 2010. That was a better time, obviously. So in this intro, we basically talk about the not only the recent development in the past 10 years, things really move in a very negative direction, but also talk about the overall structure. What are the key elements that have or had affected bilateral relationship, and who were the reason to for this terrible state of bilateral relations. So we talk about the Australia's bipartisan approach to China policy, and then different emphasize. Of course, the labor always couch its China policy in a regional multilateral institutional setting, albeit labor also recognizes the importance of the alliance with the US. But the Liberal National Coalition government is very much on the alliance, and considering the alliance is the anchor of Australian foreign policy. So there you see both opportunities, but a lot of constraints, especially when China's relationship with the US deteriorated during the Trump administration. So our chapter basically tried to raise the bigger question of how we could move back to the era, recalling Wigland's famous statement, engagement, and then despite the different social system that countries can emphasize particular relationship, but that should not be the obstacle to developing a relationship with all the countries and recognizing Australia as part of the region. So you have to sort of live with China and then to foster a stable and working relationship with China. So we organized the book into three kind of main segments: security, diplomacy, and then economics and business, and finally people to people in terms of education, culture, and media coverage. And so we got the best people in the city to cover all of this, including journalists, former diplomats, and then some of the top scholars in the city.
I'll just follow up before we go to our next one. You describe in your chapter that the relationship between Australia and China has a sense of drift and uncertainty, seeking an elusive anchor and a stable balance between coexistence, cooperation, and contestation. That's sort of quite depressing, maybe. Is that still your view, or are you a bit more optimistic, or is that still your view?
Well, at the time when we were writing that intro chapter and organizing the book, of course, the environment overall, bilateral relationship was very gloomy, and it was not good at all. But I think several things have changed over the last 17 months, since Labor came back to power. One of the first act that the Labor government did was just to stop this megaphone kind of a rhetoric or megaphone diplomacy, just to calm down a bit, and then to work hard on diplomacy. So within a few months, of course, from China's perspective, this also offered a good opportunity to change its own position and then to reach out. Although we talk about meeting halfway. I mean, just earlier this week, last week I was in Canberra, so some former Australian diplomats. It's not halfway. I mean, Australia had always extended the hand in trying to meet the Chinese counterpart anywhere, anytime. But during the coalition government, that was not possible. So that's one change. You put more emphasis on diplomacy rather than rhetoric. Yeah. The second is, I think, basically to engage pragmatic, interaction to restore some of the bilateral contacts and focus on specific issues. For instance, some of the trade dispute. And Australia actually had all along gone to the WTO with regard to some of these, Chinese sanctions on a number of Australian trade items, but not engage sort of a bilateral back and forth. So through the WTO mechanism, try to resolve these problems. So I think pragmatism also is very important. And third is to reach, to have a higher level dialogue on the sidelines of major summits. So Albanese met Xi Jinping and also Li Qiang in recent meetings, and Albanese is going to China on the occasion of Wigeland's visit 50 years ago. So it will be late October. So hopefully that will continue to improve, or what they call the stabilization of the bilateral relationship. So the release of journalist Chen Lei is obviously a good sign.
Thank you for that. And I should have said that we will have some time for questions at the end, sometime just after 6 o'clock. So get some questions ready. Right, now we come to the hard part, the security relationships, but which have almost dominated the debate, I think, the Australia-China debate in the past few years. Brendan O'Connor is a professor in the Department of Government and International Relations at Sydney Uni, and he's also with the US Studies Centre. Now, your chapter is called in brackets, reliable partner, Australian security, the American alliance, and China in uncertain times. Well, what's your view? Do you think things have changed since we started on this project? You know, or is our foreign policy always going to be weighed down by the sort of fear of abandonment and the worry about, in quotes, the China threat? Do you think things have improved, or have they continued to, in a lot of ways, stay the same when it comes to the security and foreign policy side?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think my microphone's on. Thanks everyone for coming out. I suppose my focus and our focus of our chapter is really one which is one of continuity, because of course the Morrison government signing up to this AUKUS agreement is a very long-term commitment, and the Labor Party going into an election, just as we were writing the chapter, was very keen to not be kind of seen to be soft on China. It got itself into a position of incredible agreement with this want to get these nuclear submarines, which are very much oriented towards containing China. This is, I suppose, the signal it's wanted to send. So the project has already maybe added another $100 billion, a $368 billion project at the estimate at the moment. The annual defence budget of Australia is about 50 billion. So that gives you a sense of how enormous this is. And this is a bipartisan project well into the future. And it's a bipartisan project also with the Americans. Of course, Australia doesn't get to choose who the next American president is. And that is going to be, you know, one of the things that we thought about and talked about a great deal in the chapter. But as regard to China, it seems to me over time, the thing that's kind of become more obvious is that it's very expensive signal sending. You know, the idea that Australia will be in 20 years' time building submarines with the British doesn't seem very likely to me. I mean, the British economy by the end of the 2030s, the average British family income will be about the same as in Poland, you know. Will the Brits be sending plumbers to Poland? Are we wanting to build ships with this kind of very much declining kind of industrial power? So it's a very expensive way of suggesting that Australia is very much in lockstep with the United States with regard to China. It sends, I think, quite strong signals about Australia being willing to have some commitment in a conflict over Taiwan. But I think a great deal of the detail that has been put out over the last year will not happen. I mean, there are impracticalities, they're expensive, it is enormous. So it's, you know, that there isn't a huge amount of change on the Albanese government's approach to this particular centerpiece of some ways of Australian-US alliance sort of security policy. I mean, we all welcome the increased diplomacy, we welcome the reduction of sort of megaphone diplomacy, but it reminds us that the foreign relations are structural to a large degree, and the rhetorical elements are nice to hear, and we can talk about them, and there's a lot of journalism about them, but I think AUKUS keeps Australia in sort of a particular relationship with the US and a particular relationship with China in terms of security. You talked about fear of abandonment. I mean, that's a term from Alan Gingell, who died earlier this year, a great sort of thinker on Australian foreign relations and someone who's really sadly missed as a voice of, I think, reason and a voice of moderation. I mean, Gingell's argument is sort of so clear in the fact that when the United States was incredibly unpopular with its NATO allies during the Iraq War or during the Trump presidency, Australia chose to get often closer to the United States. That fear, I think, is very clear. As I started my comments with, will that continue if Trump was re-elected as president of the United States? Will be one of the great dilemmas, I think, for a Labor Party into the future. If the Labor Party gets re-elected, you know, once or twice and Trump is president, this will be a very difficult question. And this is one that caused us a lot of pause for thought in our chapter to say, if you don't get to choose the president of the United States, which is obvious, a 30-year agreement may be difficult in terms of Australia's relationship with China.
And I'll just follow up with another question on that. there are two strands, well, there are several strands, but I mean, you've got the economic strand that we have of China being Australia's by far the largest trading partner. And absolutely, I've seen it, the business on both sides, people want to do business. There's the complementarity in the economy, very, very strong economic and very strong people-to-people ties. But at the same time, China itself has become more nationalistic, spending more on arms and more openly, perhaps, you know, active in the Pacific. Some people might call it aggressive. Can Australia, as a small nation at the end of the world, the end of the Asia Pacific, can we work through those two issues? Because essentially these are the two issues that we need to work through, and we need to do it with some sort of nuance, which Australia is often not very good at.
Well, I suppose this dilemma is most starkly put by Hugh White. I mean, Hugh White's work in this area puts the stark dilemma of Australia wants to continue that trading relationship, and it cannot do that much about China's potential interest in Taiwan or China's growth is just natural as a growing major power, as a growing great power in the world. And I suppose our chapter to some extent in thinking was to not go fully to that degree, to say, okay, are there more creative ways of thinking about these issues rather than just falling into a kind of realist sense of power politics is going to dominate this and Australia needs to look after its economic interests. And that, I suppose, for me, has been one of the disappointing elements of the Albanese government, that there's a kind of robotic sort of approach, particularly to AUKUS, that's not particularly creative. We heard a lot early on that Australian foreign policy would be more multicultural in its presentation. It would emphasise the Indigenous people of Australia. That obviously has suffered a bit of a setback this weekend. So the sense of Australia as being able to think more creatively and present a more creative approach to the security dilemmas, I think we've got a long way to go. And we've got a lot of need to think much more sort of fulsomely and think much more creatively on that front. And I don't think, particularly the Prime Minister's speeches on this issue, haven't particularly impressed me.
Okay, we might come back to some of those issues later. We now want to turn to some of the economic issues in Australia's ties with China, which is something I've followed for over many years. Now, one of the chapters here, one of the important chapters is lessons from the rise and fall of Chinese investment in Australia. And the two authors of that chapter, Wei Li and Hans Heydrichs, I said that right, from Sydney University, have been following the rise and fall of Chinese direct investment here over the past few years. They produce an annual survey in connection with KPMG. And this is an area which doesn't seem to have had much improvement and may not have significant improvement at the moment. But Wei Li, what are the lessons that, you know, from your chapter and from seeing this issue of Chinese direct investment in Australia reducing, where do you see it going, and what are the lessons for that in terms of our relationship?
So thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming here today. So, right, so the investment part is something that we have been working on, actually tracking Chinese investment into Australia for nearly a decade now. So when we actually wrote the book, and I think there was a workshop in Sydney University, and then I think at that time I was saying I was very pessimistic about that relationship. And I think over the 2 years, you know, things have changed, but I think I'm still pretty sure that I'd say that on the investment part, you know, there's still a major challenge to overcome for that investment to come back to where it were before. I think one of the lessons from that is really comparing to the trade relations. I think the investment relations is much more delicate and multifaceted. And when we look into the last decade of Chinese investment, so it's very different from that trade relations. Sometimes it can be fairly transactional. I think in an investment relationship, there's multiple discourse and debates that are happening, and that would have an impact on the actual investment behaviors. So one of that, I think in the initial days, there was much discussion about the commercial side of the Chinese investments, about, whether this is political driven or is this commercial driven. So it would have some impact on, in the end, the actual investment coming in. And then gradually the discourse have moved into social side. That's where we're seeing there's lots of debates about Chinese companies or individuals buying real estate or farms in Australia. That, of course, also have shifted the policies, regulations, but also the behavior of the Chinese investments. And then I think then in recent years, there's more and more security and political debates on that as well. So that would also have an impact on the bilateral investment relations. So I think it is much more dynamic and much more delicate compared to when we look into the trade relations. The other lessons, I think, when we're looking back on the Chinese companies that are investing in Australia, over the 12 years, I think there's 3 things that were quite interesting looking at them. One of the things is that they are quite adaptable. So when I look into, the early stage of Chinese companies investing in Australia, state-owned enterprise, but very much driven by headquarter mandate, what they need to do, offtake resources, to when you look into 2018, 2017, there's a diverse group of Chinese companies that are investing in Australia, that they're learning very rapidly, and they're working with different partners and really actually building up their global value chains. They're very adaptable. The other thing is about their long-term planning as well. So, with the investment up and down, particularly over the last few years, I've seen some Chinese companies withdrawing their investment from Australia, but that's not the majority of the case. So actually a lot of the Chinese companies that I've interviewed before, they remain their operation in here because they have a long-term planning, long-term objective in terms of their investment. I think the last part is about that global value chain, that a lot of the Chinese company, particularly towards the later part, since 2016 and 2017, when they look into Australia, more and more they look at Australia as a very important role in them building up a global enterprise and global value chain. So I think that's the learning about Chinese companies. So finally, I think the learning for Australia, if there one thing, is that quite interestingly, that towards the later stage when we work with a lot of Chinese companies, that they usually describe Australia as a testing market. So it's not just about offtake resources and, just buy things, but actually a lot of companies started to realize Australia being, a Western country built on Western rules and regulations, being a fairly mature market, have a small population, it's actually quite good for a lot of Chinese companies to use it as a pilot market to launch product, to build up brands, and before they break into, for example, US or the more complicated European market. So gradually I see Australian getting that reputation for that, which I was really pleased that it's not just about resources, buying this, buying that. And I'd also seen that it's also been more and more recognized by some of the other Asian investors in Australia now. For example, some of the Japanese companies also start to seeing, when they need to globalize, start to seeing Australia having that reputation. So I guess that part from Australia is also, that gaming itself as a country for reputation as a testing market for emerging economies.
Hans, what do you think? We've seen a lot of FIRB Foreign Investment Review Board becoming much stricter when it looks at things like critical infrastructure. We've seen several key rejections of Chinese companies making takeover offers that have hit the public, and then we hear behind the scenes a lot of companies withdraw. But it seems that when you listen to the Chinese ambassador here, that China would like to invest more and they would like to have a more constructive relationship, and they see this as maybe a bit of a what they see as improved relations, but they don't. But you know, do you think that there is a chance of improvement, or do you think that essentially, I mean, despite the attraction of Australia for Chinese companies, that the Chinese investment in Australia will fall?
Well, you've written a lot about that, and that is quite important to have that perspective that you often take, that you talk to companies and see what's happening in the background. I think there's clearly two trends that we are looking at, and there's an economic rationale and an economic trend, and there's a political trend that is driving the whole way in which the system operates. We have tried in our chapter and other writings we've done to focus on the economic perspective and see developments from that side, rather than looking at the details of the political machinations, which are quite complicated and which are, of course, to quite a degree outside of the control of Australia, in the sense that they are coordinated with what we call the like-minded partners and others. So we have given up a degree of sovereignty, not in a dramatic sense, but in a very practical sense, that we coordinate our decisions in regards to investment with other partners, and they probably do the same on their side to some degree. So the starting point really for trying to make sense of what is happening is what Wei was talking about, and Wei's actually done quite a bit of quantitative research as well, which points to the fact that the dependence of China on Australian raw materials is really only one side of the coin. And what we do easily overlook is that we are dependent in a number of more complex ways on China as well. The argument behind that, or what we see in the press and what we see in public perception, is that in the end, we depend on the Chinese domestic market, which is true, of course, to a large extent, but what we easily overlook is that we depend on the domestic market, and we, at the same time, to a large extent, on China's global role as a global manufacturer. So China is, by buying our iron ore, for example, is drawing Australia into global markets where we would not be if our iron ore, for example, was not converted into electric vehicles by China and then sold to Europe. And that's quite a large percentage. There's estimates that could be around 20 to 30%. So that is something that is important for our global development and our global integration. So I think that's the first point to make, that on the Chinese side, clearly China is dependent on Australian raw materials. That's the case for iron ore, it's the case for energy. It is more recently the case for the new minerals, that is minerals of interest to new industries, batteries, and whatever it is. But it's also, and that is crucial, not only for those big industries that overshadow everything else. We are an important part of China's textile industry. You've just written on that, the Chinese buying wool, and the Chinese buying a cotton farm in the Riverina. These are things that were approved by FIRB. So there are areas where the foreign investment review body is not restrictive, but in more critical areas, and critical is a question we'll have to think about a bit. FIRB is very restrictive. My second point really is in regards to our own interest, because we are also dependent on China in the sense that we need China to get into global markets. And that's where Wei has done quite a bit of research. It's actually quite an important part of our export trade, that through China we get into global markets. And that is, yeah, it's textile, it's agriculture, it's of course the new metals, lithium and so on, that drive the whole new energies. So, and that's where China really is an indispensable partner, because China has all the capabilities to process those materials, such as lithium, which is not a very clean industry. One might not want to have all of it. But what we have, we are more likely to get from China than from other partners. Probably not the US, probably not Canada. In a way, China is the country that could help us on that side to move up into upstream and, well, more downstream processing, that we get a larger part of manufacturing out of our exports. And that's where the diplomatic issues come in. Economically, it's fairly straightforward, but we are not in full control of what we actually do with our raw materials, because then it becomes critical material suddenly. We don't know what is being critical. Quite often these definitions can change very quickly. And in the end, what bothers Chinese investors is not so much that they are excluded from certain areas, but that the atmosphere and investment is largely unpredictable. It's very hard for them to, and you know very well, it's very hard for them to figure out what will get approved and what will not get approved, because these definitions are so vague. So we've lost part of the economic rationale, and that is in the end the conclusion of our paper, that there is a strong economic rationale. Both sides have learned how to deal with each other, but we're not at the moment making much use of that in area where it would be really important.
Okay, all right, and I'll just have a quick mention of my chapter. My thesis comes from from what I believe is the complementarity of the Australian economy and the Chinese economy. I mean, we have resources, we have food, we have, you know, wool, we have cotton, which China wants. And China we have a very small market. We think we're perhaps, we have a large continent, but only 25 million people. So as an export market, China is fantastic for Australian companies who can produce things that China's want to buy. And on the other side, our manufacturing industry isn't very well developed. With more than 1 billion people and a very efficient manufacturing industry, China can produce high quality products at a good price that Australia can't do. So the other part of our relationship is imports. Australia imports lots of manufactured goods from China, and the next thing to watch is probably electric cars. People have been buying expensive Teslas, but it's BYD, which makes electric cars in Shenzhen, which will bring in and supply a lot of electric cars to perhaps ordinary Australians. So, and this is different from America's relationship with China. And this is what I think this fundamental complementarity should mean that we have a different view of China than America. It's in both our economic interest to trade, but it has been interesting in this tense political time that business leaders who have a long history in China, who go there a lot, whose companies do business there, they have been very low key. A lot of them have been afraid to speak out, but they continue to go and do business. But it's interesting that political debate has made them quite silent. And in fact, recently, I worked for the Australian newspaper. A major company was inviting some journalists in to have a briefing with some of their senior leaders. And one of the journalists said, "Oh, invite Glenda because you're a big exporter to China." I wasn't invited because they didn't want to have any discussion of, they just regarded that as too sensitive a topic. But anyway, but on the other hand, companies are eagerly awaiting to see if relations improve, if tariffs get now dropped they've been dropped on barley, and if they can get dropped on wine, we should see a revival of Australian wine exports to China. Now we get on to perhaps the human side of the relationship. You know, the media side, the cultural side, the education side. So Wan Sun is Professor of Media and Communications at UTS in Sydney, and you have a tough job because you follow closely the Australian media, and so much of it has been negative and perpetuating the China threat. So perhaps you can tell us what are some of the points in your chapter, and do you think, you talked about Cold War journalism, China threat agenda, framing the relations, but also in the media coverage. So do you think there's any improvement or any change?
Thanks, Glenda. Oh,
Thanks. Yes, the research for my paper was kind of conducted about 3 or 4 years ago, and so when the book came out, Labour got in, and so it is naturally the logical question is, has Australians' journalistic coverage of China changed or improved since I wrote that chapter? And I would like to very much say to you, yes, it has improved a lot and it's changed a lot, but I can't. Yes, indeed. What happened since I wrote the chapter is that Labour won the election. And as a result of that, we have seen a change in the way the government conducted its business with China. And we have seen a much calmer language, and more sort of careful rhetoric. And I think Penny Wong's very well-crafted and well-rehearsed saying that we must cooperate where we can and we disagree where we must, and we always act in our national interest. And this is something that's been said again and again and again. That's almost like the mantra for the Labour government. So yes, indeed, calmer rhetoric and a careful use of words and language, which has made it harder for media to make a story out of it. And that is one change. But having said that, the change of government hasn't really stopped media from trying to make a bad story out of China. So if one of the key findings of my paper is that, to put it really crudely, bad China makes a good story. So it is in the interest of the media, whether it is a public broadcaster, media service, public service broadcasting, or the Fairfax media, or the so-called, right-wing sort of tabloid media or Murdoch media. And it is always important to maintain prescriptions, to grow readerships, to make a profit. And it's particularly difficult for media to do that in today's day and age, where the sector is facing really, really intense competition, particularly with the online and digital media and the social media. So media is desperately trying to stay afloat, and reporting China is unfortunately one of the areas where they see some possibilities of making a change, so to speak. So do I see any real hope for change, real change? Not really, because I think media as a beast, it marches to its own drum, and it's not dictated by the government, by DFAT, or by what is in the national interest. And then of course the question of what is in the national interest is also open to debate, depending on who we're talking about and whose point of view we're looking at. And so, and also from the point of view, if you look at some of the key stories, media stories that have been published since Labour got in, then you probably wouldn't find it hard to agree with me. For instance, the very well-known or the infamous Red Alert series published by Sydney Morning Herald, which only came out earlier this year. That's way after the Labour got in. Also the perennial stories about the Chinese-looking people likely to be spies, that kind of terrible story that was published, the Daily Mail, suspecting the 3 Chinese-looking people with a camera at the aviation show, as being likely spies simply because they have a fancy camera in front of them and they're interested in airplanes. So, that kind of suspicion, this kind of distrust, that narrative, disloyalty is a kind of perennial stories that gets trotted out from time to time. You only have to look at today's ABC stories about China, where Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, is again telling you a story, giving you examples. I'm not actually saying Mark Burgess was telling stories, but I'm saying that the point of view of the securities continue to be privileged over the points of view of other voices, such as the business sector or even the Chinese Australian communities, for instance. The other point that I think I'd like to make is the argument for continuity rather than change or improvement in the media sector is the fact that, as Brendan was just mentioning, I think that Labor was trying to sell the AUKUS to the public. And the fact that China is has been even quite explicitly mentioned by Richard Miles as one of the reasons why the AUKUS is necessary. He came this close, in fact, explicitly mentioned the possibility of China as a military threat, as a justification for AUKUS. So as a result of that, media is sort of rhetoric about the imminent war with China or China threat, and China as a military aggressor, all this kind of discourse may have actually done very well in providing a favorable public opinion environment for the government to actually push its AUKUS deal to the public. So I think that, whether you'd like to care to acknowledge or not, and the relationship between defense and military and security and the media and the government remain still very, very close and broad.
And just make a couple of points there. It's disappointing to see Stan Grant having left the ABC, because I think he was trying, he's worked in China, and he was trying to perhaps put some different views about, or just get some information out about China in his China Tonight program. But if I can just be a little bit of a devil's advocate there, I've worked in China. It's very difficult as a journalist, and, 2 people I worked with had to leave China. You've seen the situation of Cheng Lei, she was working for China Television, so that was slightly differently. But China doesn't make it easy for journalists to go. And currently there are some Australian journalists in China, but no journalists from Australian media in the wake of what happened to, Mike Smith and Bill Birtles having to leave. So, how much of the China treatment of media and journalists is reflected in the media, or is a factor driving some of this negative media coverage?
Well, Glenda, I think you're right. I don't think it's an ideal situation for Australian journalists to be reporting on China from Taiwan. And I think as soon as possible, they should be, allowed to go back and do their job based in China. And so, I think it is a no-brainer that the Chinese really should actually, the government should really think about the implications of continuing to deny visa to the Australian journalists. But having said that, I have to say that my observation of the Australian media's coverage of China in the last few years is that the quantity or percentage of the material that's actually produced by our correspondent, even when they were in China, is minuscule in comparison with the onshore journalists reporting on Australian-China relationships. People like, Peter Harcher, is now touted as Australia's expert on global China. He doesn't know Xi Jinping, which one is a surname, which is one's first name, So in other words, you don't really have to be literate in Chinese language or to have been to China to become a China reporter, and much of the stories where most of the stories we're reading from the Sydney Morning Herald and ABC are written by Australian journalists who write about China just as if it's just another topic. You know, yesterday they were covering tax, and the day before yesterday they were covering disability, and today they are covering China, as if China requires no special expertise and no intimate knowledge. So if you look at the coverage like that, a component in a great majority of the coverage is about Australia-China relationships, about security issues, about espionage, about academic freedom in Australian universities, about Chinese students, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's not produced by Bill Berto or your colleague Will Glasgow, you know. So, but having said that, I'm absolutely for, you know, sending them back to China as soon as possible.
Okay, we'll move on now to education in Australia. Thanks to a lot of Chinese students, has become a major exporter of education. And Tony Welsh is a professor of education at Sydney Uni. He's an expert at studying drilling down into the role of education, the history of Australian education ties with China. Now, obviously the ability of Chinese students to come to Australia was cut back because of COVID, and now it's coming back. Do you feel the things are getting back to normal? I think your chapter talks about the restrictions on the potential of the relationship. What do you see those as being?
Thanks, Glenda. It's always intrigued me slightly that in forums such as this, where we're talking about Australia's relations with other countries and in international relations more generally, we talk about economics, we talk about politics, we talk about international relations. But despite the fact we all work in universities, we're all in higher ed, somehow that's never really an issue. So it was pleasing to be asked to develop the higher ed chapter. And it's important for some of the reasons that you're indicating, Glenda, not just because we have and have had for quite some time tens of thousands of Chinese students studying at our universities, who then often go back and have a positive view of Australia and want to continue relations, whether it's in business or other areas. But also, some of them stay here and become an important part, we mentioned before, the Chinese diaspora, which is something like 1 million or more now in this country. For a country with a population of 26 million, that's significant. But more particularly, we have a substantial and growing and vibrant Chinese knowledge diaspora here. That is high-skilled mainlanders who come here, often do their PhD here, and then stay. And there's some luminous examples here sitting in front of you. So those are particularly important in terms of forming bicultural, bilingual, bilateral bridges that are really important for research, for example, but also for joint teaching and mobility programs and so on. Those are people who've often got very well-established networks back home in China, and are very willing to foster bilateral relations and help build bridges between the two countries. And as China has become spectacularly a worldwide knowledge power, those sorts of relations are even more important. And Australia, particularly, more so than in other countries, has a record of collaborative publication and research with other countries. That's now particularly important. China is now one of our largest knowledge partners, more so in science and technology. And as people have pointed out, that's become somewhat problematic over the last few years as security has overtaken diplomacy. Collaborative publication and research in the social science and humanities, a lot of which goes on through centres such as ours, is somewhat more complicated, partly because social science is so culturally embedded. There's quite a bridge to cross between the two different strands. Whereas if you're an engineer or a physicist, they all talk pretty much the same language. But on the other hand, as I said, security relations are impinging on that. And I think it's having an impact on mainland colleagues working here, not just here, but in other countries too, who feel like they should be a bit more cautious. They don't want to put their head up over the parapet in case there's it might attract criticism or more. So the net assessment, I think, is that we're dealing with a very complex set of relations. There's COVID, there's increasingly rivalrous and rancorous relations between the US and China, with the US pushing its allies to do much the same, including in areas of academic collaboration and research collaboration. On the other hand, we have a strong record of working with China. So I think it's altogether a fairly complex picture, and it has picked up lately. And I think we all hope that it will continue to do so. But the fact that we've had so much emphasis on security over the last few years makes that a rather complex picture.
Is there a, I mean, well, yeah, looking forward, I mean, as you say, we're coming out of COVID, students are coming back, but do you see, what is the potential for growth? Or, I mean, there's plenty of competition from other countries for Chinese students, and also their local universities are getting more and more. So, I mean, do we see it as a J curve which is picking up, or are there constraints on this growth, and perhaps do we need to take it more seriously in terms of perhaps not taking necessarily Chinese students coming here for granted?
I don't think we can take it for granted, but I think there's still, despite the prospects of a demographic decline in China, so that age cohort will be somewhat smaller, there's still an appetite for education, particularly overseas, but particularly in English language countries. Yes, there's certainly more competition, including from Asia, from countries like Singapore, and certainly from China itself, where its leading universities are now highly competitive and much better funded than ours. I'm going to Tsinghua next week, and their budget is between 2 and 3 times that of this university. So their leading universities are much more prominent now. They're literally world leading in many fields. But there's still, that's highly competitive. So a lot of youngsters who want to get to those universities can't, and so may well choose an overseas university. We still have to compete, of course, with the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and increasingly Asia as well. But I think the prospects are still fairly strong.
Okay, now to our last panellist. You've been waiting very patiently there. En Ang is Professor of Cultural Studies in Western Sydney University, and your chapter is Cultural Diplomacy on the Ground, Bridging the Australia-China Divide. And, you know, you're talking about the sort of human factor, the ties with the Chinese diaspora here, looking at something like the National Foundation, and the human side of things. I mean, and you're arguing the importance of cultural diplomacy as a way to improve relations. Now, what do you see as, where do you see that as going? Are you sort of optimistic, or what role can it play in re-engaging or engaging with China?
Well, that's a big question. Well, it's interesting thing about cultural diplomacy is that it is a very slow process, right? So cultural diplomacy is often seen as, well, as an afterthought really in relation to the harder topics of economics, business, and security, things like that. So people tend to forget about the importance of culture and people-to-people relations at a very societal level as an important underpinning really of the relationship between China and Australia. And the interesting thing is, and I would say that cultural diplomacy really what it needs to do, cultural diplomacy can be very state-driven, and of course China itself does a lot of that, and sometimes it actually doesn't achieve a lot of success precisely because it's so state-driven. Cultural diplomacy that is more at a distance from state control, government management and things like that can be much more successful in the sense of that it works on the ground. So that's why I'm talking about cultural diplomacy on the ground. So it's about improving cultural relations. It's about cultural exchange. It's really about increasing the mutual familiarity between Chinese and Australians. Now, interestingly, in the last 40, 50 years, since there is an official China-Australia relationship, cultural diplomacy has been very much on the agenda because somebody like Stephen Fitzgerald, for example, has from the beginning said how important it is to have a cultural diplomacy remit at DFAT, because it's not just about the transactional relationship between the two countries. It's really about creating trust, making cooperation and collaboration more possible, and nurturing really the bilateral relations at the people-to-people level. So the Australia-China Council, for example, was there for a long time. It has funded a lot of projects, many different cultural projects. Much of that, I have to say, often has limited value or long-term value because it's about showcasing, let's say, like, you know, you have an exhibition or a symphony orchestra going to China and then giving some concerts. That is, in some ways, you could say that that's showcasing, and then the Chinese public might see some of that, but there is no real longer-term outcome from that. That changed after a while. There was much more emphasis towards the end of the Australia-China Council activities in making those exchanges much more about collaboration. So that's a good thing. But the ACC was disbanded in the height of the acrimony. The Morrison government disbanded it and replaced it with a year later or 2 years later with the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. There was a lot of controversy around that as well. In the beginning, amongst others, it was clear that there was very little in the council itself, the advisory board, that there was most of the Chinese input was not from mainland China, but from Hong Kong or Singapore or other Chinese Australians. But I think it has improved. That has definitely improved, and now the National Foundation has a much larger budget than the ACC, and it also funds not just cultural and arts activities, but media, education, science diplomacy is very much part of that as well. Collaboration between universities is now an important aspect of the funding provided by the National Foundation, but also that there is an important remit now on more activity focusing on the Chinese diasporas here in Australia itself. And I think that there is still much more to be done, because we've already heard that well, there is one Chinese diaspora, and I'm using it in the plural because it's important to understand, and many Australians don't understand this. There is not just one Chinese diaspora. There are multiple diasporas, but there are older Chinese communities, there are newer ones, and of course, the focus often is in terms of more recent discussion on the focus is on the PRC Chinese, but of course we have Chinese Australians who have been here for 5 generations, or people who have come from Southeast Asia, etc., etc. So understanding the plurality of Chinese in Australia is important, and I think the idea of the bridge that was mentioned earlier, I can't remember who said that, is important too, but it's a very different kind of bridge where if you come from PRC and come to Australia, then you have that direct link perhaps, but when you have people whose ancestors are from the gold rushes, let's say, they have a very different relationship to China, and so I think in Australia, there is still an enormous lack of not just China literacy, but also literacy in Chinese Australian communities. And there is much more to be done in that aspect.
It was interesting, when I was living in China, the National Museum in Canberra sent a big exhibition of Aboriginal art all to many countries. Went over a few months in China, and that went down really well. And I also saw the Australian Ballet and the Australian Opera do productions in China. And I thought, well, you know, this is a very non-political way. If people like opera, they like ballet. It was I thought a great way to engage, but. It is interesting too when you talk about the role of a Chinese diaspora here. That's being recognised, I think, by the political parties as they realise the longer people stay here, they become citizens and they vote. So perhaps they need to look at that. You know, they're starting to drill down into, well, maybe they're different kinds of people have different kinds of backgrounds, different voting patterns.
Well, I think that the issue also, we saw that a bit in a few years ago when there was that debate about foreign interference, for example, that there were 3 Chinese Australians being berated by, who was that politician again? So yeah, that they had to condemn China, otherwise, that was the implication, they would be seen as traitors of Australia. Huh? So there is a bit of almost like this sense of if you're not for us, if you're not against China, then you're not for us. And so there is this emphasis on loyalty that is imposed on Chinese Australians of whatever background, which I think makes it very hard for a lot of Chinese Australians to actually be honest about and nuanced and you know, about the complexity of the relationship between Chinese and Australians. And in that sense, I think it's really important to, in the context of cultural diplomacy, to think in a much broader way about what is the national interest. The national interest is not just about we Australia here, there's China. In fact, precisely the diasporas can make that boundary much more fluid, much more porous, much more kind of like forgiving in a way, in establishing kind of a relationship that is more harmonious. So in my chapter, I'm talking about, let's not talk about loyalty as the emphasis of cultural diplomacy with Chinese diasporas. Let's talk about conviviality. That is to say, we need to understand that living together implies accepting and recognizing that we have differences. And in terms also of attachments, right? You can't expect people who have moved here from China or who actually have long-term Chinese ancestry to forget about their background. You know, so that emotional attachment, familial attachment, etc., will continue to be there, and that is something that needs to be recognized as well.
Well, thank you to our panelists. I think you can realise there's a lot of expertise and a lot of experience developed over many years of interest, and which is reflected in their chapter. Now, I'd like to open up the floor to questions, and if you can say your name and your affiliation. Now, are there any, and if you want to address it to any specific panelists, that would be good.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for all the speakers and for organizing such a meaningful forum. My name is Francis Lee. I think I agree with the sentiment that our relationship with China has improved very slightly from the present Labour government, from the previous one, but I think we still have a long way to go before we can get to anywhere. We cooperate when we can, we disagree where we must. I think that's a truism. But more than that, it's not a friendly language. Why do they keep repeating that kind of language? I think the thing is very difficult now for the Australian community to improve. The whole society is now under this feeling, you know, that's where the bread and butter is, you know, all the media, they think, well, that's how I should behave. Like, a certain name has been mentioned earlier. I won't repeat his name, but I have seen his performance coming out from China. At one time, he was trying to get in to reporting on a certain building, which he suspected as something. And he repeatedly aggravated the guard until he got an angry face for the camera. Now, that is a kind of journalist that I would think that make China not welcoming him. But we see that all the time, all the journalists in Australia is atrocious. I've complained to ABC. ABC is supposed to be the most fairest. I complained to them many times. I think, you see, Australia is getting into this vicious cycle. The journalists think, the media think that that's where the bread and butter is. In turn, they influence the politicians. I do wish they have the courage of Paul Keating or Gough Whitlam, but we don't have that kind of Labour government, Labour politicians at the moment. And I just think that it's a long road. It's a time limit, is it? Okay, so sorry.
We've got a few minutes.
Yeah,
I'm
sorry. Okay, I'll stop.
Do you have a specific question, or is that a comment?
Yeah, thank you all for a great session. My name's Tim Payne. I'm Director of Higher Education Policy Projects in the Vice-Chancellor's Office. I just had a question for anyone that's got an interest. We didn't talk about foreign aid or development, and China's investing a lot in the region. Australia's got the Pacific Step Up. Would it be naive to expect that Australia could possibly collaborate with China on aid projects in the region?
Anyone want to take that, Brendan or Tony? Yeah. Or Jackie?
Sorry, is that on? Yes. I think we've already got a fairly well-established record of collaboration across a range of fields. There are particular initiatives like BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on, that are huge and with a substantial presence in the Pacific, the Asia Pacific. I don't know that there's a lot of joint work between our two countries on those sorts of projects. I think so far we're fishing in the same pond, but somewhat separately. I do think there's more potential than has been realised so far.
Brendan, hands?
I suppose I was going to say something to the first comments as well, that in the last federal election, if you look at the seat of Chisholm in Melbourne in the southeast, if you look at Bennelong, one of the seats outside on the sort of edge of Perth, there was a sense of Chinese Australians as kind of swing voters. I mean, there was a sense that the rhetoric of the media and particularly the rhetoric of the Morrison government was felt by these voters not to just be aimed at the Chinese Communist Party, but at Chinese Australians, and that sense of how that group of voters are going to be maintained by the Labor Party rather than maybe go to some kind of teal candidate into the future is probably something for the Labor Party to think about in terms of, is it just the tone, that these people are interested in, or is there some degree of substance that will need to keep these people, those blocks of voters, which I suppose more sophisticated study needs to be done of, but it was, I think, quite significant in the last election. Given a close election, Labor didn't, have a huge kind of margin. Thinking about those voters, I think, will be important into the future and kind of speaks to your point about different types of Chinese Australian voters. Some of them may be more conservative in those seats, but feeling a sense of racism driving them towards the Labor Party.
Just very briefly, we had a project with the China Studies Centre on China and the Pacific in Australia. The problem from the Australian side was that there is not very much economic substance to justify larger corporates to engage in the Pacific. There would, however, be enough social substance for Australia to engage even with China in the Pacific. And that's something that is argued from the Pacific side, that in a way, for many of those people, their home base or the place that links all the Pacific Islands is more Brisbane than any other place. That's where they have families and children and so on. So Australia could play a role, especially Queensland, to link with the Pacific and play a role there and cooperate with other partners if we weren't in a situation where this is simply impossible at the moment because of the clear geostrategic issues and the polarization that has happened.
I would add to that is there are still some security concerns. So you definitely have the room for collaboration because Australia's been there in the Pacific for a very long time. Lots of experience in terms of ODA types of supporting the economic development, poverty elimination, all of that. And in recent years, of course, if you watch Australian government, a steady decline of foreign aid. So of course, these island states want investment to help them, with infrastructure to economic development. And then China, through its BRI, of course, is in the position to do that. And so I can see potential collaboration with the Chinese kind of infrastructure money, but Australian expertise and knowledge. And so you have a kind of a collaborative rather than competitive, zero-sum game playing, leaving the Pacific Island countries behind. But I would emphasize, I think the security consideration continues to trump economic consideration. Just think about Australian government has been trying to convince, and certainly successfully, for a number of Pacific Island states to discontinue is the undersea cable development. So the Australian would subsidize, provide money if these countries would start collaborating, accepting Chinese investment in the, laying down the undersea cable because of security concern over, communication.
We've got about 10 more minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Up there.
Hi, Peter Hannum. I'm a journalist with The Guardian. I was a former Beijing-based correspondent, and it should be said, a former colleague of Peter Harcher, who's much maligned and not here to defend himself. Personally, I thought the Red Alert series, the structure that was quite bizarre, lock up a bunch of people in a room for several days and come up with an answer about China. I mean, frankly, they should try that for the Middle East politics and see if they can come up with an outcome. Might be good for online traffic. However, I don't think that was necessarily why they did it. Anyway, I would say that Peter Harcher, though, is a serious journalist. I do think he knows which is the surname and the given name. Maybe sub-editors might have scrambled it. But in any case, look, I guess my question, though, that was my short comment. My question is really twofold. One is, I'm kind of curious to see how much, Australia can keep talking about, disagreeing when we must and the like, embracing AUKUS, all those sort of things. I'm kind of curious to see how long that can continue and still have that sort of warming tone. Maybe we'll have that visit later this month, and then we'll go back into some kind of a chill. I don't know, it could open a new door or so. But you've got that particular channel of development. The other one, which I'm trying to understand, is you've got the rush to decarbonize, which we kind of have to do. China is a leader in a whole bunch of these industries. US and Europe are trying to catch up, but they're going to have sort of market restricting measures to try to favor their products over China's, maybe soon to be tariffs on, say, Chinese EVs into Europe. So a country like Australia is going to have to decide, or maybe others will decide for us, which are the two kind of camps, because I can't really see how we can say embrace the IRA in the US and they will have then restrictions on China without us somehow also getting kind of, restrictions from the Chinese side. So I think Australia kind of is going to have to choose one track or the other. And if the history is any guide, it's going to be the US track. Anyway, that's sort of my broad question. I don't know if anybody wants to pick that up. You can sort of see that, de-risking, decoupling, is going one way, and Australia's going to have to choose.
Anyone like to come in on that, Brendan? I mean, are there limits to, I think the gentleman earlier made the comment about Penny Wong's rhetoric. Are there limits to that? Are there limits to the change in the nature of the relationship, or are they plateauing?
Yeah, I suppose the long-term want is not to choose. And maybe some of the signalling over AUKUS is this very expensive and very loud declaration of support for the US alliance at the same time as thinking, well, rightly, there's not a domestic manufacturing industry of cars. The demand for electric vehicles will be high. So that deferring of choice, I suppose, is the obvious position for the Albanese government. It's a government that had the rhetoric of, I suppose, the last Morrison government and the rhetoric of Peter Dutton particularly, which was kind of putting Australia in that position where a choice seemed like it was something Australia wanted to make rather than the last thing Australia really wants in many regards. So, you know, that's where I think the kind of political debate around elections is probably really important. Whether this becomes an election issue next time round, I think will be significant. But, you know, the obvious point going way back is that there's a want not to choose. I mean, that is the obvious kind of position for Australia to take. And so how much of the, you know, rhetoric around the US alliance and Albanese's speech, say in San Diego, is around, we talk this up, but then we just want to get on with the economic side of things at the same time.
Yeah, I actually just read an opinion piece on the climate collaboration between between Australia and China. So one of the points I'm thinking in the mind is not about choosing US or China, Australia. It's about actually being a latecomer or follower in the whole climate change debate, or actually having some potential to lead in this debate. So I think one of the examples we were talking about before in the renewable energy sector, which is in the solar renewable energy space, there's actually quite a lot of research collaboration between China and Australia. And I think a lot of people would acknowledge that Australia researchers has actually contributed enormously to China's solar photovoltaic industry, and in the end leading the world. I think that similar possibility could have happened in the electric vehicle space, and unfortunately now it's not happening. So Glenda actually had mentioned about BYD was made in China, right? It's going to dominate the Australian market, but all the Tesla is actually made in China that you're buying in Australia at the moment. So the statistically showing that 87% of the electric car that are sold in Australia are actually made in China. But Australia somehow was left in a position that in terms of global companies is right in the bottom in terms of their supply priority, that you have to wait for a year to get a very expensive electric car. Then we have a very vibrant lithium mining industry, but in the end, we put ourselves into a position that we just like the iron ore industry, you know, dig out the dirt and then ship it to China. That's the end of the story. So I think the choice is not about China or US. The choice for Australia is about now just being happily content about its position to wait for the world to wake up for this whole renewable energy revolution or whatever, you know, climate change action. And then Australia is just following it. And without actually taking an active action to have a chance to be actually in some space, you know, have a saying in it. Because when you look into the electric car industry, it's very different from the traditional automobile industry. It didn't really require very complicated kind of supply chain or technology. You know, there were discussions even before about Australia can have its own electric car industry here, but I don't think that's in the debate at the moment now. If we continuously think the choice is about US and China, it's actually not. It's about, you know, just being a follower, just quietly following the world. I mean, the last point about that, you know, you talk about the anti-dumping possibilities, right? The same story with solar industry, you know, that there's an economic rationale and strategic rationale for European countries to put an anti-dumping kind of a regulation on China because they have an industry there. It's irrelevant for Australia at all. So there shouldn't be even a debate for here, you know, apart from, you know, you really just coming from a political or security point of view.
Now, we need to wind it up, but there was a lady up there who very patiently was wanting to ask a question. So we'll make that the last question.
Yes, thank you, Glenda. I think it's also good that I think I'm the only woman that's asking a question. My name's Daphne Lowe Kelly. I am part of the Chinese Australian diaspora, my grandfather having come here in the 1890s. However, also I am very familiar with China, having first gone there probably before most of you were born in 1958. However, question I want to ask, I'm now the chair of a museum known as the Museum of Chinese in Australia that we are trying to establish here in the Haymarket area. Now, obviously, this has been going on for several years now, but with the what attitudes that especially with the previous government, it's been very difficult for us, obviously, to raise funds. Now, I know that it's also difficult that we are not allowed to take funds from the mainland, but there are obviously businesses here which are Chinese, probably headquartered in China, and they would probably be ones which would be of assistance. So my general question is, if any of you have got any ideas how I can get this funds up and running so we can get this museum open as soon as possible, I'd be very appreciative.
Does anyone want to make a comment on that, or we've got one more questioner up the back?
Oh, thanks, Glenda. My question is actually for you, because you were mentioning that despite the bilateral tensions, Australian business owners had been very eager to trade with China, and they were quietly actually trading with China. So I just spent an afternoon lecturing our students on how Chinese business owners use direct and indirect channels to lobby for policies to be changed, to be made. So my question is, do you see Australia's foreign policy making has channels to address interests of the Australian private business sector as well? So in what ways could this interest be reflected in Australia's China policy?
Well, there are, the Business Council of Australia has got a sort of international group headed up by Warwick Smith, who's a long time been going to China for many years, a former federal government minister. And I do think there are a lot of behind the scenes discussions with business. But as I said before, their business leaders are keeping quiet. But I think that they have made their case, and the Albanese government does recognise there's advantages in the trade. The Australia-China Business Council, they had their China Networking Day today, and they work hard at promoting Australia-China business ties, but also in dealing with the government. And quite specifically, I've talked a lot to Treasury Wine Estate, which makes Penfolds, was the biggest wine exporter to China before the tariffs. And I know they've dealt with the government on the specific issue of the WTO case in wine, and before that, the barley industry. So business does talk to Canberra and gets a response, but you know the government has to work in within the broader political sort of framework. But anyway, just to wind up, I think it will be interesting to see Albanese's visit 50 years on from Whitlam's visit, and what comes of that. Is it historic, or is it just a little bit more of the same? I know there's more questions, but I think we better wind it up. Okay, all right. Well, look, thanks so much for our panellists. All of them have, if you want to read in a lot more detail, you can get the book. And I think Professor Sun has made the comment, not liking what you read in the Australian media. Well, in this case, this is a very constructive exercise to really drill down in these particular subject areas, put together some constructive ideas. So there's more. There's more than just the newspapers. But thanks so much for our panellists coming today and your contribution in the chapters. And I hope, and I think it will play a very important part in the Australia-China debate. And thanks very much for you, JD, for